There are places in the cosmos where light has never been welcomed, places older than prayer, deeper than memory, quieter than the moment before a heart stops beating. The underworld is such a place. For countless centuries, no dawn has broken across its black horizon, and no living voice has disturbed its silences. The dead do not measure time here. They measure only the slow accumulation of forgetting. And yet, on this night that was not a night, something impossible happened. A star fell. It tore through the ashen sky above the eternal city of the dead, a streak of blinding gold cutting across a heaven that had known only shadow. Towers of obsidian trembled. Bells forged from the bones of extinct titans rang without hands to swing them. In the great courtyards where revenants stood in silent formation, heads turned upward for the first time in 1,000 years. The falling star screamed as it descended, and its scream carried the harmonic note of a living heart. It struck the wastelands beyond the city walls, hurling ash and shattered bone across a plain that had never known thunder. A crater bloomed in the gray earth, its edges glowing faintly, as though the ground itself had forgotten what warmth was and could not decide whether to embrace or reject it. Inside that crater, Clark Kent opened his eyes. For a long moment he did not move. He could not remember how he had arrived, only the sensation of being pulled, of an invisible hand closing around his soul and dragging him downward through layers of reality he had never known existed. He rose slowly, his cape hanging heavy with dust, his chest rising and falling with a breath that tasted of iron and old incense. He looked up, searching the sky out of pure instinct, expecting the sun that had cradled his cells since the day he was born. There was nothing. No warmth, no hum beneath his skin, no golden thread connecting him to the source of everything he was. For the first time in his life, Superman could not feel the sun. And in its absence, he understood a truth so quiet it terrified him. He had always believed his strength was his own. Now he stood in a realm where that belief could not follow. Around him stretched impossibilities. Mountains rose in the distance, but they were not stone. They were faces, thousands of them, mouths open and expressions frozen between grief and awe. A river wound through the plain, its waters black and murmuring, whispering names that sounded almost familiar. Above the horizon, the silhouette of the eternal city glimmered with cold violet fire, its spires piercing a sky that refused to hold stars. He began to walk. He passed a procession of hooded figures leading children by the wrist. The children did not cry. They did not speak. Their eyes were the color of extinguished candles, and when Superman met their gaze, none of them seemed to see him. He passed a marketplace where souls were bartered like grain, poured from urn to urn by merchants with silver rings sewn into their skin. He passed a tower where a single voice sang endlessly, and the song was made of every regret its singer had ever confessed in life. And everywhere he went, the dead whispered, "A living man. A living man walks among us. The sun has come down into the dark." He tried not to listen. He tried to focus on finding a way home, but then he saw them. A dozen souls chained at the edge of a ravine, spectral hunters raising blades of pale flame above their heads. The execution was routine. The prisoners were guilty of nothing more than remembering. Superman did not think. He moved. The blades shattered against his forearm. The hunters were thrown back like autumn leaves. He tore the chains apart with hands that trembled from the effort, and the freed souls stared at him as though a myth had walked out of scripture. One of them, an old woman with eyes like cracked glass, gripped his wrist and spoke a prophecy that had waited millennia for a listener. When a star falls into death, either the night ends or eternity does. Then the ridges above them filled with armored revenants, and at their head rode Selene. Selene did not draw her blade. That more than anything unsettled him. He had expected steel, ritual, the clean choreography of violence he had faced 10,000 times before. Instead, the vampire warrior sat motionless upon her pale-eyed steed, studying him the way a scholar studies a text written in a language older than her civilization. Her armor was black and silver, worked with sigils that hummed faintly in the presence of his weakened aura. Her face was carved from certainty. Her eyes, however, held something rarer than certainty. They held doubt. Behind her, 100 revenants stood in perfect stillness, The freed souls huddled behind Superman, trembling but no longer running. The old woman had not released his wrist. Selene finally spoke, and her voice was quieter than he expected. "You are not mortal. You are not undead. You are something the laws of this realm did not prepare for." Superman rose slowly, placing himself between her and the survivors. He offered no threat, only presence. "I am trying to understand where I am," he said. "I want no war with you." A soft, humorless breath escaped her. "War is not something one chooses here. War is something one inherits." She dismounted with a grace that made no sound. Step by step she approached, and he felt the strange pressure of her scrutiny, a mind trained across centuries measuring him with the patience of a jeweler. She stopped an arm's length away. "Every soul that enters the underworld belongs to it," she said. "That is the first law. To leave is not escape. It is rebellion against the order of existence itself. You have already broken 3 laws simply by breathing. Do not break a 4th by hoping." He held her gaze. "I cannot promise that." Something almost like a smile crossed her mouth, gone before it could soften her. They walked. She did not command him. She did not chain him. She simply began moving, and he followed, because she was the only voice in this realm that had spoken to him as an equal rather than a myth. The revenants dispersed at a gesture, melting back into the ridges like a tide returning to its ocean. The freed souls trailed behind at a distance, unwilling to leave the warmth of his shadow. The journey to the citadel of echoes wound through territories that reshaped his understanding of suffering. In one valley, lichens in iron collars hauled sledges piled with luminous ore that Selene told him was refined soul stuff, the raw fuel of the necromantic engines that kept the vampire courts alive. In another, entire villages stood frozen in perpetual dusk, their inhabitants performing the small rituals of a life they no longer remembered, sweeping doorsteps that led nowhere, kissing children who had faded to silhouettes. He intervened 3 times. Each time cost him something he could feel. He broke a lichen's collar and lifted a fallen slave from the mud, and afterward his knees buckled for the first time in his adult life. He shielded a necromancer's apprentice from a punishment ritual, and the world tilted for a heartbeat before righting itself. He carried a forgotten mother across a chasm because she asked him softly to remember her name for her. Selene watched all of this without comment, until at last she said, "You will die here saving people who cannot be saved." "Then I will die trying," he answered. She studied him a long time. "Nobility," she said, "or foolishness. In this realm they are the same coin." They reached a rise overlooking the citadel and saw the banners before they saw the city. Black banners. New banners. Marcus Corvinus had spoken. A bounty had been declared upon the living sun, and every faction had already begun to move. Vampires, lichens, necromancers, deathless warlords whose names had rusted from the tongues of history. Behind them, the old woman touched Superman's cape and whispered that she remembered her son's face for the first time in 400 years. He looked at Selene. He did not ask what to do. He already knew he could not leave. The river Lethe did not flow. It considered. Its waters were the color of a starless well, moving with the slow deliberation of something aware of every soul that had ever tried to cross it. Selene led him to a stone jetty where a ferry of blackened wood waited without a ferryman. She told him the rules in a low voice. "Do not touch the water. Do not speak your name aloud. Do not look at your reflection for longer than a breath. The river remembers," she said, "but only by taking." They pushed off into the current. The citadel of echoes glimmered on the far shore, a spire of pale marble threaded with veins of living silver, and for a moment he allowed himself the smallest measure of hope. Then the arrows came. They struck from 3 directions at once. Marcus's hunters had ridden ahead through the mist, their skiffs low and predatory, their crossbows loaded with bolts forged from consecrated silver. The first bolt grazed his shoulder, and he felt it, truly felt it, the sting of a wound that would not have troubled a Kansas afternoon. He staggered. Selene was already moving, her blade drawing arcs of moonlit ruin across the closest attackers. He fought differently here. There was no leaping into the sky, no shattering of tanks, no gale-force breath. Every motion was measured. He caught a bolt in mid-air and turned to deflect another with the same hand. He shielded Selene when a hunter loosed a net of woven death magic. and the net closed around his arm and burned him with a cold that reached into his bones. He tore it free and threw it into the river, and the river swallowed it without a ripple. A hunter fell overboard. Superman saw the panic in the man's eyes as the water began to lap at his throat. Dove, Selene shouted after him, but he was already beneath the surface. And the moment his skin met the river, the visions came. Krypton, the red skies cracking, his mother's hand pressing him into the pod. Jonathan Kent standing in a Kansas field, saying son in that voice that had been the anchor of every hard decision he had ever made. Lois on a rooftop, waiting for a sunrise. She was still waiting. She would always be waiting. He surfaced with the hunter in his arms and did not remember the man's face for a full second. His own name flickered inside him like a lamp in a storm. He clung to it. Cal. L. Clark. He forced the syllables back into place and set the hunter down on the ferry deck, and the man wept openly, unable to comprehend why the enemy had spared him. 2 more hunters saw it. They lowered their weapons. One of them, a young revenant with copper hair, whispered that Marcus had told them the living son was a devourer. That was not a devourer, he said. That was a father. They crossed the rest of the river in silence. The citadel of echoes received them like a wound receives a hand. Its oracle waited in a chamber where no shadow could hold shape, an old woman without eyes whose voice sounded like many voices layered one atop another. She placed her palm on Superman's chest and drew a breath so long it seemed to draw the room with it. You did not fall, she said. You were called. He asked who had called him. Not who, she answered. Why? Beneath this realm sleeps a hunger older than the first grave. The dead have named it 1,000 times. The oldest name is the truest. The hollow sun. It devoured worlds when stars were young. It was chained long ago by one who bore your light. The chains of failing. It reaches upward, and it reached for you. She turned her sightless face toward the depths beneath the citadel. Something in the dark is remembering how to be hungry, she said, and it has decided that you are the key. Selene's hand found the hilt of her sword. Superman did not move. He was already listening. The descent took 3 days that felt like one long-held breath. They passed through vaults the citadel's keepers had not opened in living memory, down stairways carved into the throat of the earth. The air grew heavier. The whispering of the dead thinned to a hush, then to silence, then to something worse than silence, a listening quiet, as though the walls themselves leaned closer with each step. Selene walked ahead with a torch that burned cold blue. Superman followed, one hand trailing along the stone because his balance had begun to fail in ways he was still too proud to name. At the bottom they found a city, not a ruin, a city. Its streets were intact, its towers were intact. Only its people were gone, and their absence had a shape, a residue pressed into the walls like the memory of a scream held for centuries. Murals ran the length of every avenue, painted in pigments that still glowed faintly, telling a story older than any faith Selene had ever sworn to. They had worshipped stars. That was the first thing Superman understood. This civilization had knelt before suns as living gods, had built observatories the size of mountains, had sent prayers upward on wings of song. The murals showed them dancing beneath a sky ribboned with light. Then, 3 panels later, the light was gone. A darkness with no shape but hunger came down through the heavens and drank their world dry. Selene lifted the torch to the final panel and went very still. A figure descended into that darkness, alone, cloaked, a cape that fell in familiar folds, a crest upon the chest that Superman could not quite read from the angle of the wall, but did not need to. He had worn it since boyhood. He touched the mural with fingers that trembled. Someone like me, he said. Selene answered without looking at him. Someone exactly like you, long before your world had learned to speak. They found the chamber at the city's heart, and there the truth arranged itself with the patience of a story that had waited millennia to be told. The hollow sun had not been slain. It had been imprisoned by a being whose power came from a yellow star, a champion who poured his light into a seal and became, in doing so, the anchor that held the seal shut. The murals did not show his face after that. They showed only the seal, radiant and vast, and the emptiness that had once been him. And they found Marcus Corvinus waiting there. He was not what Superman expected. No throne, no crown, no army at his back. Only a tall, gaunt man in black, his silver hair bound behind him, his eyes carrying the exhausted grief of a ruler who had counted every soul under his care and found the number unbearable. "I did not ask for this crown," Marcus said quietly. "I inherited a prison and called it a kingdom. Every soul here is chained to a wheel that will never stop turning. They do not live. They do not die. They forget and remember and forget again, and each cycle carves them thinner. If the hollow sun rises, it ends. All of it. That is not annihilation. That is mercy." Celine lowered her blade a fraction, not because she agreed, because she understood. "Some of them want it," she murmured almost to herself. "I have heard them praying for oblivion. I have heard them praying for anything but this." She turned to Superman then, and her voice softened into something she had clearly not permitted herself in a very long time. "I used to pray for oblivion too," she said. "Lately I have begun praying for something else. I do not have a word for it yet. It feels dangerously close to hope." The Oracle's final message reached them as they stood before the sealing stone. The prison was not responding to Marcus. It had never responded to Marcus. It was responding to him. Kryptonian light was the key. The prison itself had reached across the veil and summoned its next anchor. Superman closed his eyes. Marcus did not lay down his cause. He could not. Grief that old does not lay down. It only marches. The assault on the ancient vaults began at what would have been dawn, if this realm still remembered dawn. His armies came in tides, deathless warlords upon skeletal chargers, necromancer choirs whose hymns pried the stones apart. Lycan war packs loosed from their collars for the first time in a generation, howling not with rage but with a terrible, exhausted relief. They believed they were marching toward the end of pain. Superman could not hate them for it. He fought at the mouth of the vault beside Celine, and the vault held, and the vault held, and the vault broke. The seal cracked with a sound like a cathedral learning grief. A darkness poured upward from the fissure, not smoke, not shadow, but an absence in the shape of a sun, the hollow sun. Its edges were ringed with a corona of eaten light, and where its shadow fell, souls simply ceased. There was no scream, there was no ash, there was only a soft unmaking, as though a name had been erased from a page mid-sentence. Superman moved. He carried whole cohorts out of the shadow's path. He shielded a Lycan mother and her cubs with his own body and felt the corona brush his shoulder and take something from him that he could not identify, only miss. He caught a falling tower on his back and set it gently down upon a hill of the forgotten. Each act was a coin spent from a purse he could no longer see the bottom of. The underworld itself began to unravel. The river Lethe boiled and bared its stone bed. Mountains of faces slumped inward as the memories that had built them evaporated. In the eternal city, bells fell silent forever, not from stillness but from forgetting how to ring. Souls he had rescued only hours before turned to him with confused eyes, unable to recall his name, unable to recall their own, unable even to recall the concept of names. His allies began to whisper. "He brought this," one of them said, not cruelly, only tiredly. "Marcus was right," said another. "Better an ending than this." He heard them. He did not blame them. Celine fell in the third hour. A tendril of the corona lashed toward a cluster of forgotten children, and she was already there, sword raised, taking the strike across her chest. Superman caught her before she hit the ground. Her armor was cracked open like something struck by winter. Her eyes were still bright, still hers, but the light within them had begun to gutter. "You cannot save everyone," she whispered. "I have to try," he said. "That is not an answer," she said, and closed her eyes. He carried her to a broken shrine at the edge of the battlefield and laid her upon the altar. He stood beneath the lightless sky and looked up at a heaven that had never held stars. And for the first time in a life defined by certainty, he spoke the sentence he had spent his entire existence refusing to admit. "What if I cannot save this world?" The words did not echo. There was no room in this realm for echoes anymore. The hollow sun answered him. It spoke without a mouth, its voice threaded directly into the marrow of every living thought within reach. It told him it had not summoned him to break its chains. It had summoned him because chains, in the end, were only ever a delay. It wanted more than release. It wanted passage. A living star-born soul was the only vessel capable of carrying its hunger across the boundary between death and the universe of the living. Through him, it would enter Earth. Through him, it would enter every sun. It offered him a choice, which was not a choice at all. Surrender and end the suffering of this realm. Refuse and watch it end anyway, along with everything he had ever loved. He knelt beside Celine and pressed his forehead to hers, and for the first time in a long while, he prayed. Marcus found him at the shrine. The king of the underworld did not arrive in armor. He arrived in the plain black of a mourner, his crown left somewhere behind him in the ash. He looked at Selene upon the altar and then at Superman upon his knees, and something in his face collapsed inward with the quiet dignity of a man who has been wrong for a very long time, and has only just begun to understand it. "I wanted mercy," Marcus said. "I did not know mercy could hunger." Superman did not answer. Marcus knelt beside him, two rulers of nothing kneeling in the dust of a world neither of them had made. "I will fight beside you," Marcus said. "It is the smallest amends I can offer. It is the only amends left." Word of the alliance moved faster than word of the ending. Vampires who had spent centuries hunting lichens stood shoulder to shoulder with them in the ruined avenues. Necromancers who had trafficked in the suffering of forgotten souls now sang those souls back toward themselves, calling names across the dying dark. The freed prisoners of 1,000 centuries picked up whatever they could carry, shovels, prayer beads, broken swords, and walked toward the fissure without being asked. Selene rose. She rose because Superman placed his hand upon her chest and gave her a portion of the light he could no longer afford to keep. Her wound closed, her eyes opened. She looked at him with the particular fury of someone who has been saved without her permission. And then she looked past him at the gathering army, and her fury softened into something older and warmer. "Lead them," he said. "I intend to," she answered. The hollow sun tore open the sky. The battle that followed did not resemble any battle Superman had ever fought. There were no enemies to strike, only a vastness to withstand. The hollow sun manifested in 1,000 smaller shapes across the underworld, pieces of its hunger given form, and every faction met them where they emerged. Marcus rode at the head of the deathless legions and drove the largest manifestation into a canyon, holding it there with chains of his own soul, feeding it his centuries so it could not feed on anyone else. Selene led the combined armies through streets that were unraveling beneath their feet, her blade catching what light remained and giving it back to every soul she passed. And Superman inspired. That was the strange, quiet weapon no one had expected. As he moved through the crumbling city, souls looked up at him and remembered. A blacksmith remembered the smell of his forge. A mother remembered the weight of her daughter. A soldier remembered why he had made down his sword. Each memory was a small refusal, a single point of light in a realm that had been taught for centuries to forget. And the hollow sun could not swallow what refused to be forgotten. Its corona weakened. It shrieked, and the shriek was the sound of a hunger discovering for the first time in existence that it might not be fed. Superman flew into its heart. There was no sky to fly through, only the throat of the eclipse itself. And he flew because he had decided, at last, what he was going to do with the light he had left. He reached the seal at the entity's core. The seal recognized him, as it had always recognized him. It offered him the same bargain it had offered the champion in the murals 1,000 civilizations ago. A living star-born soul, an anchor, forever. He thought of Lois. He thought of a Kansas porch at sunset. He thought of every rescue he had ever performed and understood that this one would not be witnessed, that this one would not be thanked, that this one would be the only one that mattered. He poured himself into the seal. The light he had carried since the day a red sun died above his cradle passed through him and into the ancient stone, and the stone drank it, and the darkness drew back, and the prison closed. But the seal did not close upon nothing. It closed upon him, folding around his consciousness the way a hand folds around a candle to keep it lit through a wind. The prison rose. It rose through the layers of the underworld and hung in the sky where no sky had ever held light. It became a sun, a slow, warm, golden sun above the land of the dead. Below, faces turned upward. For the first time in memory, shadows fell behind them. Selene wept and did not try to hide it. The sun above her was Clark. Time, which had never truly moved in the underworld, learned how. It learned slowly, the way a child learns a language, one syllable at a time. The new sun rose, and the new sun set, and between its risings the realm began to breathe in rhythms it had forgotten it was capable of. Souls counted days again. They gave names to the hours. They began, tentatively, to plant things in the gray soil, and the gray soil, warmed for the first time in ages, remembered how to be earth. Selene became guardian of what remained. She had not sought the title. Titles found her the way weather finds a mountain. She walked the avenues of the eternal city with her blade sheathed more often than drawn, mediating disputes between vampire courts and lichen clans, arbitrating between necromancer conclaves who no longer had souls to sell and no longer wished to. She built a council in the shadow of the light, and the council convened beneath open windows, because for the first time in memory, there was something worth letting in. Fragile peace is still peace. She had learned that from him. Legends began as legends do at the edges. Travelers spoke of the Sunkeeper, a silent figure sometimes glimpsed within the radiance overhead, arms outstretched, cape drifting in a wind no one else could feel. Pilgrims left offerings on hilltops where the light fell most warmly. Children born of souls who had chosen to remain, souls no longer forced but staying by choice, drew crude pictures of a man inside a sun and hung them in doorways for luck. Selene did not correct the legends. She let them grow. On Earth, the strangeness was quieter but no less real. Farmers in Kansas woke at dawn feeling watched and did not mind. Sailors at sea reported dreams of a red cape moving across a golden sky and could not explain why the dreams left them at peace. In Metropolis, Lois Lane stood at her window each morning with a cup of coffee gone cold in her hands. She could not have said what she was waiting for. She only knew, in the wordless certainty of a heart that had loved a man made of light, that he was not gone, not entirely, not in the way the world insisted. She refused, on principle, to grieve him as if he were. In the underworld, at the end of an ordinary day that no longer felt ordinary, a child came to Selene at the steps of the council hall. The child was small and shy and one of the many who had chosen to stay. She pointed up at the warm gold above them and asked a question the whole realm had been circling around for a very long time. Is the sun a god? Selene knelt so their eyes were level. She did not answer quickly. This mattered. No, she said at last. He was a man. He was a man who came to a place made of endings and refused to let darkness be the end of the story. He gave us his light so we could keep telling it. The child considered this with the seriousness only children can manage. Then what do we do? She asked. Selene looked up at the sun. She thought of a river that had once tried to take his name. She thought of a mural in a buried city. She thought of a promise she had not known she was making until she made it. We keep telling it, she said. The child nodded and ran off into the golden afternoon. Far above the underworld, in the place between the light and the living, something happened that no oracle had foreseen and no legend yet knew how to hold. A crack traced itself along the edge of the sun, not a wound, a seam. Through it, for a single fragile moment, a voice reached the being at its heart. A voice he knew before he knew his own name. Clark, it said. Inside the sun, something stirred that had not stirred in a very long time. The story ends before he answers, but he heard he.